Welcome to Beyond the Evidence, the podcast where the shadows of doubt meet the light of truth. I'm Stacy, and he's Adam. Together, we'll journey into the heart of real-life mysteries, peeling back the layers of fact and fiction to uncover what truly lies beyond the evidence. Each week, we dive into cases that will make you question everything you thought you knew, from unsolved disappearances to chilling true crimes, and even perplexing phenomena that defy explanation. With that said, let's jump into today's episode.
All right, let's dive into a case that just won't let go, the Laci Peterson case. Even after 20 years, it's still making headlines, still sparking debate.
Yeah, it's a case that really captures the imagination.
So today, we're going to try and sift through everything, all the twists and turns, try to separate fact from fiction, see if we can understand why this case became such a cultural obsession.
It's one of those cases that you just can't seem to shake, you know?
Exactly. But at the heart of it all, it's important to remember this is a real tragedy. A young, pregnant woman vanishes, and a seemingly perfect life just unravels.
Absolutely. The human cost of this case is something we can't forget.
Right. Okay, so picture this. Modesto, California, Christmas Eve, 2002. Laci Peterson, 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, at home preparing for the holidays. Sounds pretty normal, right? But then her husband, Scott, reports her missing.
And that's where the story takes a turn.
He says he went fishing that morning, and when he got back, Laci was gone.
Just vanished.
But here's where those seemingly small details start to matter. Like, the fact that their dog was found wandering the neighborhood with its leash still attached.
Oh, yeah, that's a detail that jumped out at a lot of people.
Hold on, so the dog's out with the leash, but Laci's nowhere to be found.
Right.
That's strange.
Definitely raised some eyebrows for investigators. Remember, at this point, they're just trying to put together a timeline, figure out what happened.
Yeah, of course. So you've got this missing pregnant woman on Christmas Eve, and now a detail about the dog that doesn't quite add up. I can see why people were immediately hooked on this story.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the community response was huge. There were massive search parties, everyone hoping for a good outcome.
I bet.
But as the days turned into weeks, with no sign of Laci, that hope started to fade, and the attention shifted towards Scott.
Makes sense. What was it about Scott's behavior that made people suspicious?
Well, his demeanor during the search, which some people saw as detached, unemotional, started to draw scrutiny. And then there was his refusal to take a lie detector test.
Okay, so now we're getting into true crime territory. A husband acting strangely, a missing wife, and a refusal to take a lie detector test.
It was definitely a turning point in the case.
And then the bombshell, Scott's affair with Amber Frey, comes to light.
Yeah, and it's not just any affair. He told her he was a widower.
He told her he was a widower. Wait, before Laci even disappeared?
Weeks before. It completely changed the whole narrative.
Wow. So now it's not just a missing persons case. There's a potential motive emerging. Let me get this straight. We have a missing pregnant woman, a husband who's acting suspiciously, and a secret affair where he's claiming to be a widower weeks before his wife vanishes. This is intense.
It was a case that just kept getting more and more complicated.
Yeah.
It just blew the case wide open.
It's like you're at home watching the news unfold, and every day there's a new twist, right? But then, 4 months after Laci disappears, the search takes this heartbreaking turn.
It does, yeah. In April 2003, the bodies of a woman and a fetus washed ashore in San Francisco Bay,
Oh, wow.
not far from where Scott claimed to have been fishing.
That's just chilling.
Yeah.
Absolutely chilling.
DNA testing confirmed the remains were Laci and her unborn son, Connor.
And that just completely shifts everything, right?
Yeah. I mean, the location so close to Scott's supposed fishing spot, that really solidified him as the prime suspect.
Okay, but even with all this circumstantial evidence, was there any physical evidence, directly linking Scott to the murders?
That's the thing. There wasn't a murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no confession.
Really?
The prosecution's case relied heavily on Scott's behavior, his affair, inconsistencies in his statements, and a lack of, visible grief over his wife's disappearance.
So they were building a case around his character, his actions, rather than hard proof. That must be a tough sell.
Yeah, it was a risky legal strategy.
Tech time.
The defense argued that the prosecution was relying on speculation, innuendo, not concrete evidence. They said there was no clear motive and suggested Laci might have been abducted by someone else while walking the dog.
So you've got this huge media frenzy, and then you've got this courtroom drama with two very different stories being told. Did all the media attention make it harder to have a fair trial? I mean,
Well, it's impossible to say for sure.
yeah.
But that constant media coverage, it definitely shaped how the public saw Scott Peterson. It was hard to escape those headlines, the 24/7 news cycle, picking apart every little detail.
Yeah, I remember.
It was everywhere.
And ultimately, the jury had to sift through all that noise, all that circumstantial evidence, and decide if it was enough to convict. A lot of pressure.
Yeah, and they did.
Wow.
In November 2004, Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for Laci's death and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son, Connor.
So after all that, a guilty verdict. But even with the conviction, I remember there were still people who had doubts, right?
Oh, absolutely. The lack of that direct physical evidence continued to fuel debate. Some people were convinced by the prosecution's story, while others felt there were just too many unanswered questions.
Yeah. It feels like this case, it became a kind of Rorschach test for people's beliefs about the justice system, about the media, about everything.
It did, you're right. It sparked conversations about the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, and how media bias can influence not just public opinion, but maybe even legal outcomes.
It really makes you think, huh?
Yeah.
It's got everything, the tragedy, the media frenzy, the whole courtroom drama, and even after the verdict, you're still left with all these questions.
It's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah.
And so frustrating at the same time.
Right. Like, we have the legal outcome, but you still want to understand the why. What would drive someone to do something like this?
Exactly.
Let's put on our detective hats for a second. I know we can't get inside Scott Peterson's head, but is there anything, from criminal psychology that could shed some light on possible motives?
Well, it's always tough to speculate.
Of course, yeah.
But we can look at patterns in similar cases.
Right.
Sometimes it's about wanting a new life, freedom, escape from responsibility.
A fresh start.
Right. Other times it might be about money or even a messed up need for control.
So there's no single explanation, but there are these sort of common threads that criminologists look for when they're trying to figure out a motive.
Exactly. And in this case, with the media playing such a huge role, you also have to think about how all that external pressure might have affected Scott Peterson's actions, his decisions.
It's like that whole trial by media thing. Before the trial even started, a lot of the media had already made up their minds about him. Did that create a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And it raises some really important ethical points about how we cover these kinds of cases. Can you really have a fair trial when public opinion is already so heavily influenced by what they see in the media?
That's a big one. But back to the psychology for a minute. Is it even possible for someone to do something so awful and then seem so detached?
Well, that's where things get really tricky. Human behavior can be unpredictable. Sometimes people react to trauma, to stress, in ways that we just don't understand, ways that even seem, offensive almost.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean they're guilty, but it definitely makes things more complicated.
Okay, so we've got this puzzle with missing pieces. And no matter how hard we try, we may never have all the answers.
Right.
What do you think is the biggest takeaway from the Laci Peterson case? Like, what's its legacy?
For me, it's a reminder that truth can be really hard to find. We have the legal verdict, but we might never fully grasp what motivated this tragedy, the exact circumstances.
It's true.
And it shows us how important critical thinking is. We need to question what we think we know, acknowledge that even in a system designed for justice, there's always room for mistakes, for things to be unclear.
It's a sobering thought. Reminds us that real life isn't always a neat story with a clear ending.
Exactly. And I think that's why this case still has such a hold on people. It forces us to face some uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the limits of what we can know, about all those gray areas that exist, even when we think we have a definite answer.
So here we are, all these years later, still thinking about Laci Peterson.
Yep.
It's captivating and disturbing at the same time. It forces us to look at the darkness that can hide in seemingly ordinary lives. And even though we've covered a lot in this deep dive, I feel like we've barely scratched the surface.
It's one of those cases that stays with you. Makes you think, makes you debate, long after you've heard the details. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about finding the answers, but more about looking at this tragedy in a thoughtful, complex way.
Well said. And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives on this heartbreaking and complicated case.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mysterious and unsettling world of true crime. If you enjoyed unraveling today's story, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave us a review. It really helps us keep bringing you the stories that go beyond the evidence. See you in the next episode.